Some observers are claiming that in recent negotiations, including in a number of the recent strikes, the collective bargaining agenda has broadened far beyond the subjects traditionally covered in bargaining, and that this is a noteworthy feature of what's happening in labor management relations, and maybe even an explanation for why there are more frequent strikes occurring and some intense strikes. So, for example, with the recent strike and then settlement involving the writers in Hollywood, a key topic in their negotiations and an interesting part of their settlement is addressing the use of AI, artificial intelligence. Others have pointed to the recent 3-day strike involving employees at Kaiser Permanente, where one of the key issues was the provision of mental health services, with claims by nurses and others at Kaiser that their workload was becoming both too intense and impossible to manage, and impossible to provide good quality care to patients because Kaiser was underfunding and under-providing mental health services that were needed to complement the other clinical services being provided to patients. And another example that's being cited is the auto workers' demands for a so-called just transition associated with the potential changes involved with the introduction of electric battery vehicles. So what's up? My own perspective is there is something going on, but I'm not so sure it's so radically new. I also want to discuss whether the introduction of these issues, whether they're new or not, might explain why there has been more intense and prolonged conflicts. So, I certainly agree with observers that there's interesting issues being addressed in collective bargaining that don't involve just pay or even traditional demands for job security. AI is a really interesting issue being discussed and addressed in the writers' strike, and then now apparently is associated with issues that surface elsewhere in the entertainment sector. And then concerns about mental health provision is certainly an issue beyond just compensation concerns being expressed by nurses and others in the healthcare sector. At the same time, I'm not sure that such demands are really so new, in that I think for a number of years and in many sectors, workers and unions have been asking for subjects to be addressed that are not just concerned with directly matters associated with compensation. Workers are not just asking for more pay. They're also have been asking in the past, as they are now, for concerns about workloads and concerns about matters that influence pay or influence job security. Let me give you some examples. Teachers have long been negotiating in public education about class size. They do so both because of their concerns about the quality of education that's being provided when classes become too large, but they're also concerned about class size because it affects their workload. Nurses in healthcare have argued for a number of years about patient workload. They do so both because of concerns about the quality of care patients are getting, but again, they also have raised those issues because they're concerned about their own workload and the difficulty of their work when they're assigned to cover for so many patients. The concerns in the auto industry for a just transition. Yeah, it's interesting, I think, the way that's being articulated, the way it's associated with concerns about this deep transition occurring towards battery-powered vehicles. But I'm not sure it's raising something that's so profoundly different in the following sense. For auto workers, as for nurses, and even for riders, they're raising that issue because they're concerned about their job security. They're not raising the concerns about just transition because they have a particular interest in a certain type of combustion engine or power for the vehicle, they're worried about what the introduction of battery-powered vehicles is going to do to the demand for auto workers. Are there going to be more plant closings and layoffs because of that? So again, I think it's interesting that the parties in recent negotiations are discussing matters that are not directly, strictly about compensation. But at the same time, I think we ought to recognize that collective bargaining has long addressed matters beyond compensation. Parties are often addressing, again, concerns about workload, concerns about matters that affect the quality of job, that have implications for job security. And in that way, I'm not sure the agenda has become so profoundly different than it was in the past. Now, the other reason I think it's interesting to talk about whether or not the agenda in collective bargaining has broadened is because it's not just interesting to know what's going on in bargaining, what subjects are being addressed. That's important in its own right. But it also may be the case that if the bargaining agenda has been broadened, or if the parties are discussing matters that are beyond compensation, perhaps that helps us understand why there's been impasses or why negotiations have become so difficult. What might be the connection there? Well, if the parties are addressing a new issue, let's say artificial intelligence or the introduction of electric-powered vehicles, that's a new subject. Maybe it's harder for them to figure out how to settle that issue. Maybe it's also the case that they have very different expectations about how that issue is going to affect them. If their expectations are different, maybe that's leading to miscalculation by one or the other parties. And as we all know, part of the explanation for why strikes occur is because there's miscalculation by one side or the other. They're overly optimistic, perhaps, by what they think an ultimate settlement will be or should be. And so perhaps the fact that the parties are addressing matters, as I believe they certainly are, beyond compensation, maybe that's also helping us understand why negotiations have become more difficult, helping us also to understand why there have been more frequent strikes. The issues are new. It's harder to find compromises over new issues. It may again be harder for the parties to reach a common forecast as to what a good settlement or likely settlement is of those issues. And also perhaps some of these issues raise to matters that are so-called principled matters, matters that aren't so easy to compromise. Pay can be easily compromised. Give me a little bit more or settle on a little bit less. There's always room for compromise about compensation. But maybe when it's a matter dealing with the quality of care for patients or the fundamental transition in the nature of how vehicles are powered, maybe those are raising principled matters that again require more time, more deliberation, and also possibly lead to more frequent impasse. So I think there's something to the claim that the bargaining agenda now is broader than just dealing with compensation matters. I'm not so sure it's so new to collective bargaining to address those matters, but I also think there's something to the claim that maybe because these issues are outside of or beyond just compensation, maybe they're part of the reason it's been hard for the parties to reach agreement in a timely fashion in some of these cases. Well, those are my thoughts about what's going on in contemporary collective bargaining. Thanks a lot for listening.